Welcome to this recording called Lost in Translation, in which I will talk a little bit about why we use translation in language teaching and why translation might be an interesting skill for any humanities subject. I'll start by showing you the title page of the presentation, and then I will continue talking about the slides. My name is Silke Männchen. I am a part of the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics, and I'm a member of the section of German and Dutch. And this presentation is being recorded for the Open Day in the year 2020, while we're all under lockdown. So we have decided to record presentations that we would normally give face to face. So we're hoping that by doing this, you will have a similar access to the kinds of things that we're doing. What is it about translation? So the next slide here starts with the question that we get asked quite a lot when our students in the degree programs sit an exam involving translation. So one of the questions is, can I use a dictionary? And I'd like to tell you a little story to contextualize this. So I have a friend who studied with me at a university in Germany. So we both studied modern languages, but she also studied art history. And quite a while back now, she started working at a company in London. Her modern languages did not include English, although she had English at school. So her language was Spanish, really. When she was invited to a party by this company she was working for, on the invitation it said dress code, black tie, and she had never really come across this before. So she did ask her colleagues what it meant, and they said, well, you have to make an effort, buy something new, do not come in work clothes, wear something fancy, make sure it's special. So she thought, okay, I understand all this, so it means it's a kind of festive occasion. And then she thought, hang on a minute, I understand all of this, but the one word I don't really understand is the word fancy. I'm not sure what this means. So she looked up fancy in a dictionary and came up with fancy dress. And then thought, oh, okay, now I understand. So something special, make an effort, buy something new, all meant fancy dress party. So she decided to come dressed as a clown. Obviously that was wrong. That was not what was meant at all by the invitation, because everybody else was dressed not as a clown or wearing a costume of any other kind. So she'd made a mistake, and that mistake was really only based on her not using common sense, not trying to understand or translate the one word she didn't know within the context of the words that she did know. So this is a story that hopefully warns you about the kinds of things that can happen when you rely too much on a dictionary when translating, rather than common sense. I'll explain a little bit about this later. So these are the things I'd like to cover within this talk. I'd like to talk a little bit about translations in general, and then I'll come back to the dangers of dictionaries and machines. I'll give you an example from literature. Then I'll talk a little bit about translation and language learning, and I'll point out a few resources I found useful that might be helpful when thinking of applying to university. Okay. the purpose of translation. So I've been thinking of the kinds of contexts or the kinds of texts that need translation. So I've listed a few here. You can see they're all texts, they're documents, maybe contracts, etc. But of course, it might also involve films, it might involve music, poetry, other writing. And the purpose, I suppose, could be summarized as giving people access to information. Arguably, that's quite an important purpose of any text and therefore of any translation. The fallacies or dangers or risks when using dictionaries and machines, I try to sum up as using common sense rather than relying on a dictionary. So if my friend had relied on her common sense, she would have dressed differently and not as a clown. By the way, this isn't a picture of my friend. This is a picture I found on the internet. Then there are words that could be called untranslatables. And in fact, there is a dictionary of untranslatable terms, which seems to be a bit of a paradox. So how can you have a dictionary where you can look up words that can't be translated? But if you're interested in that sort of philosophical idea of maybe certain concepts, philosophical questions that might work in one society or one culture but don't quite translate into another culture, then this is the kind of thing that might be interesting for you. And then when it comes to using machine translation, so obviously there's Google Translate, which might work well if all you need to do is translate a menu, say, in a restaurant in a country that is not your own or the language you don't speak, then that's very useful. But these machine translations don't always cope with idioms. I'm not sure whether you can work out why I put a picture of a cat and a dog there. Maybe you want to think about this. So there is an expression in English involving cats and dogs. And if you type this into a machine translation, you usually get some funny translation that is not culturally accurate. So if you type in "it's raining cats and dogs" into the machine, you might come up with something that sounds very odd in other languages other than English. Okay, so these are just glimpses at the kinds of risks and problems you can encounter when only relying on machines or dictionaries. But how do we know when we've translated something and we've translated it well? So what is a good translation? And I went to an example from literature to explore this a little bit further. I've given you here the title of a story written by a German author called Die Verwandlung. And under this term, Die Verwandlung, you can see 5 possible translations the dictionary will come up with. So we can have the change, the changing, the conversion, the transformation, or the metamorphosis. Now, translating a title of a text will already give you some sort of idea what the text will be about. So on the other side, I've typed up some potential associations you might have with such a title. So when seeing the change, maybe you're expecting a political manifesto. When seeing the changing, I don't know, maybe you're looking at a riveting novel. The conversion might be associated with, I don't know, a religious story, the transformation, and then we have the metamorphosis. The metamorphosis, in fact, is the title that is most commonly used when talking about this story written by this German-speaking author. Let's look at the very first sentence of that story. This is the first sentence in an English translation. The sentence goes, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. And I wondered what you might see in your mind with your mind's eye. So what's the film that's going ahead in your mind when you read this first sentence? It's odd on all sorts of different levels, but maybe the gigantic insect is the oddest thing about this. What do you see? Let's look at another sentence from a different translation. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. Okay, different thing. What do you see now? Is this a different animal? So, gigantic insect, horrible vermin. Both are completely legitimate translations, completely correct translations of the German original. Let's have a look at another one. Translation number 3. Now it's a monstrous, verminous bug. Different picture in your head, perhaps? And of course, these are not the only things that differ. So I'm not even going into analyzing word order, phrases like what's the difference between uneasy dreams or troubled dreams or anxious dreams. So we have different dreams. We also have different ways at what point this character wakes up. Does it matter? Starting a story by saying as Gregor Samsa awoke, as opposed to one morning, when Gregor Samsa, as opposed to one morning as Gregor Samsa. So all of these differences will have subtle, or will cause subtle changes in how you approach the story, or what you see, or what you think about while reading this. There are many more translations of this story. I've come up with 5. So as you can see, we move from gigantic insect in number 1 to horrible vermin in number 2, monstrous verminous bug, number 3, to monstrous cockroach, number 4 and 5, some sort of monstrous insect. So lots of different things. Interesting. And I would argue, if you're not a speaker of the original language, you're completely at the mercy of whatever translation you happen to pick up. So when picking up translation number 5, you will have a different idea of what's going on in this story compared with what you will be thinking when having picked up translation number 2. So that's my first and very obvious point, perhaps, that if you don't have access to information in its original shape, all you have is a translation mediated through the translator. There are other ways of translating what is going on in a story. You can also translate into a different medium. Look at this. This is the cover of the translation of one of these translations. Not sure whether you can see this, but the cover, the letters on the cover spell out the name Metamorphosis, but the Baroque style of these letters with the 6 little legs seem to suggest we're dealing with a certain type of thing. This one here, this cover, is much more explicit. So it's clearly a bug, a beetle of some kind, already steering the reader in one way, one particular way to translate or interpret the thing that is going on. The original cover has no bug, no insect, no cockroach, no vermin. This is the original cover. So it's a story by Franz Kafka, published a long time ago. And you can see here, it's a man in a room looking desperate. And through the open door, you can see it's black. So I think it's clear from this that this is not the story of a happy man. And maybe we can have one look at the German original of this story. So here's the original. And I've tried to highlight in color some of the words. So don't worry if you don't know any German. That's not the point of this. But hopefully you can see that there are 3 words starting with the letters UN or un. And you know from English that the prefix, the letters UN, can turn a word like an adjective into its opposite. So we have something like friendly and unfriendly, easy and uneasy, like the dreams. You can have helpful and unhelpful. So often an adjective is turned into its negative. So we don't have things like, or very, very rarely do we have bad things that are turned into a positive. So we don't have bad and unbad, but we have good and ungood, for example. So these 3 Uns, we have unruhige Träume und ein ungeheures Ungeziefer. To a German reader or somebody who can understand German, these are quite strong signals, meaning this is not good. This is not going to be a happy story. And in fact, the word Ungeziefer, which is the word that has been translated in all these different ways in the English versions, means something like this, a pest of some sort. So an Ungeziefer is something that you do not want to have in the house. It's something where you call the pest control. It's something that you want to get rid of. Some people might also include pigeons into this. So I've heard people refer to pigeons as vermin. So it's a bit like vermin, it's a bit like a bug, it's a bit like a cockroach, it's a bit like a beetle. It's all of these things, and you see here there's a mouse included, or maybe a rat included in this as well. So Ungeziefer is, if you like, an umbrella term that includes all of these. But if, when confronted by a translation, we are then steered into one rather reductive way of translating this does something to the story as a whole. So remember, we had all these different things here, and I would argue, if you say gigantic, you also lose something. So gigantic and horrible seem to be options. And if I go back to the German original, the bit that is ungeheuer has both of these meanings. So it means both. It means really very big, and it means scary. So both of these translations, gigantic and horrible, are correct. Monstrous might be better because in the English word monstrous, you have both of these ideas. It's possibly big and it's possibly scary. So what is lost is the question. We're losing the all-encompassing umbrella term in the original, the Ungeziefer, if it's nailed down to something like an insect, a vermin, a bug, a cockroach, etc. We're losing this idea of it being both big, scary, different, alien. We're losing all of these terms. I would also argue that we're losing a cultural meaning. At the time when Kafka was writing, and where he was writing, so Kafka lived in Prague, writing in German. Prague at the time was part of the Austrian Empire. The term Ungeziefer was also used to refer to minority groups in society. Kafka was Jewish, and the term Ungeziefer was sometimes used to refer to Jews, for example, as a minority group in that society at that time. And to German readers at the time, that sort of cultural hinterland, if you like, might have been accessible. But that, I would argue, is lost if you look at terms like insect or bug or cockroach. So there's a bit of cultural knowledge that might get lost when the only access you have to a text is the translation. So there is something beyond the level of vocabulary, word order, expressions, idioms, that could be summarized as the kind of cultural content that might get lost. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you would be looking at when studying a degree in modern languages. So yes, you would learn lots of new vocabulary. So you would learn words like Ungeziefer, but you would also learn their context, how they were used, who would use them, with what sort of political intent. And I would argue that's getting more and more important today than ever before. So why do we use translation in education? And I've tried to say here by using this picture of a quarry that you can use texts as quarries. So you can find information. You can, of course, build up your own vocabulary by translating texts, but you can also build up your horizon. You can extend your horizon. You can build up your cultural knowledge. Of course, it also allows for flexibility. It keeps your mind very agile because you often have to paraphrase in both languages. So the foreign language you're translating into another language, as for example English. And of course, you learn to be accurate. You learn to really look at the grammar, really look at the words almost like under a magnifying glass. There are more skills, I would argue, you gain. You use common sense when translating. You have to learn to predict problems, what we would call the usual suspects. So there are some possible constructions in one language that will always be more difficult to translate into English. So you learn how to spot these. And of course, you expand your vocabulary and awareness of style. I try to kind of flesh this out a little bit more. So using common sense. When translating a word like fancy, so remember the risk of turning up as a clown, you develop intercultural awareness. You understand a term in its cultural setting. Or when predicting problems, you learn how to diagnose your own weaknesses, and you learn where to find help. You learn what to use to help you with this. So this might be a grammar book, it might be the internet, it might be other texts on a similar subject. And of course, you expand your style, your awareness of style. In a class, in a translation class, we would discuss and compare alternatives, and that will help you expand in all sorts of directions. So when you think about learning a new language, all of these things are important. Remember that only speaking one language globally is absolutely not the norm. Speaking more than one language is the norm. Many people speak 3 or 4 different languages. So when learning a new language in a British environment, you're doing something very, very normal. But of course, within a British context, you're also becoming a bit of a rarity. So that might be good for you. You also learn to think outside your first language. That might help you see the world in a different way. Um, you're making the new language your own. You're using your own style, your own voice. So this will help you reflect on your first language. Anybody who speaks more than one language knows that. So you end up forever comparing and thinking about, can I also say this in a different way? Which helps. I think that's a good intellectual skill to have. I have one slide here with a slightly more abstract way of summarizing this. Using or viewing translation as the fifth skill means that when learning a language, we usually talk about four skills. So that's reading and writing, but it is also speaking and listening, all extremely important skills. But translating might be seen as an additional fifth skill. And in our societies, which are increasingly multilingual, multicultural, this this way to kind of go across, to transfer from one culture to another culture, is becoming increasingly important. So therefore, this academic argues that it is the reason why we should see translation as being widely needed in everyday situations, not just as a specialized activity. So when doing this as a specialized activity, you're also doing something that arguably is needed in our societies. If you're thinking about skills, so sometimes it's good to think about the kinds of skills that you might want to have on your CV, then these are skills that are transferable, and these are skills that employers look at and find extremely attractive. So something like curiosity. When reading texts very, very closely, like the Kafka text, but it doesn't have to be literature, it can be any text, you're doing something, you're achieving something, you are looking at words and what they mean in context. You're being flexible. You learn to be accurate. You learn to use common sense. You expand your contextual knowledge and your cultural knowledge. You learn to diagnose problems and you learn how to remedy them, how to solve them. And of course, you expand your vocabulary and style, which is an intellectual development. So all of these are extremely desirable and transferable skills to have. And I would argue in our day and age, it's also important to be able to access information, like on the news, for example, from more than one source. So that might mean within one language. So it's always good to not just read the news from one provider, but maybe spread your sources. But if you can do that with different languages, so if you then can incorporate news from other parts of the world in their original state, so not translated, this will help you enormously in developing as a mature and responsible member of your society. If you're interested in the Kafka, so if you're interested in reading a little bit more, the text I've used is accessible online with a translation into English, and you will have the bibliography for this on the website. You can also watch a ballet. So the text, the Kafka text, has been translated, if you like, into a different medium, and that's ballet. And you can also listen to a podcast about this ballet called Kafka in Quarantine. Again, the link to this is available on the website. If you're interested in doing some more work to help you with thinking about applying to university, there's an excellent tool called HePlus. So if you Google HePlus, you will come to a website and you can see that there are lots of different subjects. So There's biology and chemistry, for example, but also other humanities subjects like English, geography, history, etc., and of course modern languages. Um, and modules are available for different languages, including German, and within the German you will find much more about the Kafka and how to translate Kafka, for example. So these are standalone modules that you can access, and everything you need for these is online. So you can do that completely independently. Have a look. You might surprise yourself with things that you might find interesting. And these are the things that might be interesting for you if you're thinking of applying. So the first bit here, the first email, the first internet address is the HePlus website. The second one, for those of you who are interested in languages in particular, is the Cambridge University Language Centre. They have um, open course open course content, so open courseware. That means that you can click on this and watch films and listen to things and do some exercises. And then, of course, there is the Cambridge University website for undergraduate study with lots of help about how to apply and how to do this. So I'm hoping that this has helped you a little bit thinking about the kinds of skills humanities students acquire, and then maybe more particularly those who want to study languages, but hopefully also those of you who are thinking about the kinds of courses and where to find information about the courses. Thank you very much for listening.